You always think Hollywood is a paradise of perfection, where silver screen stars always appear with skin smelling of expensive perfume and outfits without a single speck of dust. Wake up. That is merely the most spectacular trick television has played on humanity throughout the past century. The truth is rawer and smellier way than you could ever imagine, 1,000 times over. And the only person who had to endure that horrific truth was Johnny Carson. Throughout his 30-year reign on the throne of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson faced a nightmare that no camera lens ever captured. The audience sitting in front of the screen only saw sunny smiles and witty stories.
How are you?
Fine. I haven't seen you in a long time. I mean, except for last night, but I mean, it's been...
But they didn't know that. Under the 1,000-degree heat of the studio lights, that glamorous veneer melted away, revealing bodies lazy with bathing and clothes reeking of musty mold. The list below will completely shatter your illusions. Prepare yourself, because the sparkling images of the likes of Marlon Brando or Peter Falk are about to collapse right before your eyes. These are the 7 names that made Johnny Carson wish he could wear a gas mask right on national television. Marlon Brando, the barefoot giant. July 1999 at the sun-drenched Malibu harbor of California. Johnny Carson sat alone on the aft deck of the yacht Serengeti. He had been away from the spotlight for 7 years. His once bouncy brown hair had now turned snowy white, but he still maintained his inherent neatness with a crisp white windbreaker. In his hand was a vodka tonic, the condensation on the outside of the glass trickling down his cold fingers. The sea breeze blew strongly, carrying the saltiness of the ocean. Johnny lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and slowly released the smoke into the space in front of him. He squinted toward the horizon, but his mind was drifting back to the past. In his head appeared the image of a night in April 1968, the night he had to face a disaster named Marlon Brando. He shook his head slightly, muttering to himself that while the audience was wild with joy, he only wished he had a gas mask right then. Memory took Johnny Carson back to the NBC studio in New York more than 30 years ago. That night was considered a historic event for The Tonight Show when producer Fred de Cordova did the unthinkable by inviting Marlon Brando to appear. Johnny Carson knew the importance of this evening, so he prepared more thoroughly than ever before, being a man obsessed with cleanliness and perfection. Johnny spent an hour in the dressing room grooming himself. He washed his hands thoroughly with antibacterial soap, shaved cleanly, and chose to wear his most expensive dark blue suit. He wanted everything to exude class and elegance to match the status of the world's greatest movie star. Around 5:00 p.m., Johnny stood waiting in the hallway leading to the studio with an excited mindset, ready to welcome a sophisticated gentleman like the roles on the silver screen. However, when the door opened and Marlon Brando walked in, Johnny's expectations collapsed completely. The man standing before him had none of the aura of a Hollywood star. Marlon Brando appeared in a state so disheveled it was hard to believe. He wore a faded, tattered gray t-shirt. The fabric was thin and wrinkled as if it had been balled up at the bottom of a closet for months. The jeans he wore were baggy and faded at the knees. Brando's hair was messy, matted with sweat, and hung carelessly over his forehead. But the detail that made Johnny Carson the man who always maintained absolute hygiene feel most horrified was at the feet. Marlon Brando wore no shoes, nor even socks. He was completely barefoot. His large, blackened, and calloused feet nonchalantly stepped onto the polished floor of the television station, leaving faint dusty marks with every step. Johnny Carson tried to suppress the rising discomfort in his stomach to maintain a professional social smile. He stepped forward and extended his hand to welcome the guest. Marlon Brando laughed loudly, took Johnny's hand, and slapped him firmly on the shoulder in a friendly manner. The moment the distance between the two narrowed, a pungent and thick stench immediately blasted straight into Johnny's nose. It was not the ordinary body odor of someone who forgot to use deodorant, but a very heavy mixture of smells. It was the smell of sour sweat accumulated over long days of not bathing, mixed with the smell of musty clothes and the pungent scent of raw onions. Johnny felt dizzy. He had to hold his breath immediately and hurriedly withdrew his hand. Stepping back a pace to seek some clean air, Brando seemed not to mind at all. He still laughed and talked cheerfully, completely comfortable with his body and its raw scent. When the program began broadcasting live, the situation became much worse. Under the heat of dozens of high-power studio lights, the temperature in the studio rose, causing Brando's body odor to begin rising strongly and spreading around. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, less than a meter away from Brando's position, and he became a direct victim of this olfactory torture. The television audience only saw two legends chatting happily, but they did not know that Johnny was struggling every minute not to wrinkle his nose or show disgust. He was forced to breathe through his mouth, trying to take very shallow breaths and minimizing the use of his nose. Every time Brando excitedly leaned forward to answer a question, Johnny had to skillfully lean back in his chair to maintain a safe distance. Marlon Brando was very natural. He crossed his dusty, black bare feet over his thigh and pointed his dust-covered sole directly at Johnny. He scratched his chest, wiped his nose, and then used that same hand to stroke his hair. Johnny watched those actions and shivered. He could not stop thinking about the bacteria spreading everywhere. As soon as the director signaled that time was up, Johnny stood up abruptly, shaking Brando's hand quickly to see the guest off into the wings. As soon as Brando's back disappeared behind the velvet curtain, the smile on Johnny's lips vanished instantly. He turned to the studio assistant with a hardened face and ordered in a cold voice, "Bring the disinfectant spray here immediately. Spray that sofa thoroughly, spray it twice, and remember to open all the vents wide to kick this smell out." That night, after returning home, Johnny Carson had to bathe and scrub his body for a long time, but the memory of the smell of the genius Marlon Brando haunted him until his old age on the yacht. Orson Wells, the scent of old booze on a 150 kilograms body. The sun began to set on the horizon at Malibu, dyeing the vast expanse of sea red on the deck of the Serengeti. The air began to get chillier, but Johnny Carson did not want to move inside yet. He pulled up the collar of his windbreaker, lit another cigarette, and stared at the thick white smoke rising. That smoke reminded him of an old friend, another cinematic genius, who always appeared with a dense cloud of tobacco smoke and a colossal body that blocked out the stage lights. Johnny shuddered slightly, not from the cold, but from the suffocating feeling of old memories rushing back. He took a sip of hard liquor to chase away the bitterness in his throat, then muttered the next name on his blacklist, Orson Wells. Johnny Carson recalled the times he welcomed Orson Wells by then. Orson was no longer the handsome young man who shook the world with Citizen Kane. He had transformed into a giant man weighing nearly 150 kilograms every time he heard the news that Orson Wells was coming to The Tonight Show. Johnny's emotions were always torn between admiration for his intellect and fear of his physique. Preparing for Orson didn't stop at washing hands or wearing a nice suit. It was like preparing to welcome a storm before recording time. Johnny always had to personally check the guest chair. He had to ensure that the chair was wide enough and sturdy enough to withstand Orson's weight. He also asked the technical staff to adjust the air conditioning system to the lowest possible level because he knew Orson Wells was a giant heat radiator. When Orson Wells appeared at the studio, the first impression was always overwhelming in terms of size. He often wore baggy black outfits that looked like portable tents intended to hide his oversized body. He walked heavily, slowly, and every step was accompanied by labored gasps. But what haunted Johnny Carson most was not the size, but the atmosphere Orson carried with him. As soon as Orson approached to perform the greeting ritual, Johnny felt a wall of scent slam into his face. Unlike Brando's sour, dusty smell, Orson Welles' smell was the smell of expensive things gone rancid. It was the smell of premium Havana cigars that had gone cold, clinging tightly to every fiber of the black velvet suit. It mixed with the heavy smell of aged brandy in his breath. And above all, the characteristic oily sweat smell of an obese person struggling with his own body weight. Johnny Carson recalled the suffocating feeling when Orson sat down in the chair next to him. The poor chair creaked, and Orson occupied its entire space, even spilling over into Johnny's space, under the scorching studio lights. Orson began to sweat immediately. Large beads of sweat poured out on his forehead, flowed down his cheeks, and pooled in the rolls of his fleshy neck. Orson constantly used a large handkerchief to wipe his face, but it seemed the handkerchief wasn't enough to absorb all the water escaping. Orson's sweat smell was very distinct. It had a greasiness and heaviness that made the surrounding air become thick. Johnny felt like the oxygen in the studio was being sucked out by Orson, replaced by a cloud of exhaust fumes reeking of tobacco and old booze. He had to try to sit up straight, pressing himself against the arm of his chair to create a fragile safety distance. But that smell still crept into his every breath. Throughout the interview, Orson Welles often had the habit of smoking cigars right on air. He would pull out a cigar as thick as a child's wrist, cut the tip, and light it stylishly. Smoke began to billow blindly to the audience. It was an image of power and enjoyment. But to Johnny Carson, it was torture. The thick cigar smoke blended with Orson's body odor to form a fog encircling Johnny. His eyes began to sting, his throat itched, but he still had to keep a calm smile, at times. Orson leaned his massive body toward Johnny to whisper some secret story, and Johnny felt like he was being crushed by a mountain of meat. Orson's breath, reeking of alcohol, blew straight into Johnny's face, forcing him to hold his breath so long that his lungs began to ache. As soon as Orson left, Johnny Carson immediately sprang up like a spring. He didn't need to be polite anymore. He unbuttoned his vest jacket and waved for the stagehand. This time, he didn't just ask for disinfectant spray. He asked to turn on industrial fans. He wanted to blow away the entire gloomy cloud Orson left behind. He looked at the chair Orson had just sat in. The velvet fabric seemed to be permanently stained with color and smell. Johnny returned to reality on the yacht Serengeti, tossing the half-burnt cigarette butt into the sea. The cold wind blew, but he felt much more comfortable than the sweltering heat and suffocating smell of that evening years ago. He sighed, realizing that genius sometimes comes with a weight, both literally and figuratively, that mortals like him could hardly bear. Walter Matthau, the gambling addict with breadcrumbs on his shirt. Night was late on the Malibu harbor. The moonlight reflected sparklingly on the dark water surrounding the yacht Serengeti. Johnny Carson still sat there, but he had moved from the deck chair into the small bar in the aft cabin to avoid the cold night mist. He poured himself a glass of red wine, gently swirled the glass, and stared at the dark red color of the liquid. The space was absolutely quiet, only the sound of waves gently lapping against the hull. The luxury and cleanliness of the cabin made Johnny feel safe, but it also inadvertently triggered a memory of a complete opposite. He remembered crumpled lottery tickets, shirts covered in stains, and a characteristic scent of cheap delis. The image of Walter Matthau appeared clearly in his mind. Johnny smirked slightly, a smile half sarcastic, half weary. He put the wineglass down on the table, whispering to the empty void that if there were an Oscar for the sloppiest actor in history, Walter Matthau would certainly win the Lifetime Achievement Award without needing to act. Memory took Johnny back to a recording session in the mid-70s. At that time, Walter Matthau was a hugely popular movie star with the image of a lovable curmudgeon. But to Johnny Carson and the backstage crew of The Tonight Show, Walter Matthau was the embodiment of a hygiene nightmare completely different from Marlon Brando or Orson Welles. If Brando was the smell of wild nature and Welles was the smell of decadence, then Walter Matthau was simply the smell of a man who had just walked out of a casino after 48 hours without sleep, carrying with him the entire menu of a hasty lunch. Johnny remembered that day very clearly. He had to instruct his assistant to have wet wipes ready under the table, a preparation unprecedented for any other guest. When Walter Matthau walked out onto the stage, the audience applauded enthusiastically for his quirky and humorous appearance. But from Johnny's close-up perspective, it was a fashion and hygiene disaster. Walter wore a light brown suit, but it was so wrinkled and disheveled that one got the feeling he had used it as a blanket while sleeping in his car. His shirt collar was skewed to one side, revealing neck skin speckled with oily sweat. His curly hair was messy, sticking up in places as if he had just been mildly electrocuted. However, what made Johnny Carson squint to look closely was not the wrinkles, but the foreign objects clinging to Walter's outfit, on the lapel of his vest, and even on his dark tie. Johnny clearly saw dry breadcrumbs, a few white sesame seeds, and a suspicious yellow stain that looked like dried mustard. Walter Matthau didn't look like a Hollywood millionaire. He looked like an unemployed office worker who had just hurriedly eaten a hamburger in the park. Walter sat down in the chair, and immediately Johnny witnessed a small rain of food crumbs falling from his clothes onto the spotless studio floor. Johnny tried not to stare at the pile of crumbs. He smiled in welcome. And that was when Walter Matthau's characteristic smell attacked him. It wasn't shockingly pungent like Brando's, but it was persistent and unpleasant in a very unique way. It was the smell of strong roasted garlic, the smell of smoked meat, the smell of pickled cucumbers, and the smell of old tobacco clinging to clothes. In short, Walter Matthau smelled exactly like a Jewish deli in New York during rush hour. Johnny felt like he was sitting next to a refrigerator full of leftovers with a broken door. The garlic smell was so strong that Johnny felt it clinging to his tongue, making him taste Walter's lunch even though he hadn't eaten it. Throughout the conversation, Walter Matthau appeared extremely comfortable and charming. He rested his feet up, telling funny stories about his addiction to betting on horse races. He waved his arms to illustrate, and every time he moved vigorously. More dust and food crumbs flew off him. Johnny Carson sat there, having to laugh along with the jokes while holding his breath every time a stream of breath reeking of onions and garlic from Walter blew over. Johnny observed closely and discovered a large stain right at the corner of Walter's mouth, probably leftover tomato sauce. It sat there, teasing Johnny, the man always obsessed with cleanliness. Johnny felt itchy on behalf of the guest. He wanted to lean over and wipe it off, but he couldn't do that on national television. Walter's sloppiness was so natural that it became part of who he was, making the person opposite feel that mentioning hygiene was an unreasonable insult. Walter considered sloppiness a trophy, a trace of a vibrant and passionate life, while Johnny only saw it as unacceptable negligence. When the interview ended, Walter stood up to shake Johnny's hand. His hand was slightly sticky and damp, making Johnny shudder slightly. Walter left, leaving behind a chair covered in crumbs and an atmosphere thick with the smell of pickles. Shelley Winters, the lady with breath reeking of vodka. The clock in the master bedroom of the yacht Serengeti struck 2:00 a.m. Johnny Carson still couldn't sleep. He lay on the soft bed, listening to the sound of waves lapping steadily against the side of the boat. Old age insomnia often pulled him up at these hours. Johnny sat up, reaching for the crystal water carafe at the bedside to pour a glass. In the dim darkness, his hand shook slightly, causing a bit of water to spill out, falling onto the wooden table surface, creating a small, wet puddle. Johnny stared at that puddle, and suddenly, a wet, loud, and alcohol-reeking memory rushed back into his mind. He laughed out loud, shaking his head wearily. It was none other than Shelley Winters. Johnny Carson recalled the time Shelley Winters appeared on The Tonight Show. They were never normal interviews, they were true risk management sessions. Every time he saw Shelley's name on the guest list, Johnny had to take a deep breath to prepare himself. He knew he was about to face a woman who didn't know the concept of limits or sobriety. Shelley Winters rarely walked onto the stage with a steady gait. She usually appeared with stumbling steps, arms spread wide as if wanting to embrace the whole world, and a smile always in a state of excessive excitement. Johnny remembered a specific evening vividly, when Shelley walked out in a daringly deep-cut evening gown. But the zipper in the back seemed not to be fully pulled up, and her golden hair was messy as if she had just ridden in a convertible at high speed without a hat. She rushed to the guest chair not to sit down gracefully, but to drop her body down like a heavy sack, making the poor chair shake violently. But the scariest thing was not Shelley's clumsiness, but the smell she carried. As soon as she was settled, A hot and pungent stream of air slammed into Johnny's face. It was the smell of heavy vodka. Johnny could smell it clearly. Sharp and stinging his nose, it wasn't the smell of a glass of wine drunk with dinner, but the smell of an entire bottle consumed hurriedly in the dressing room just minutes before going on air. To hide the alcohol smell, Shelley had sprayed a massive amount of perfume on herself. The smell of cheap, sweet powder mixed with the spicy alcohol smell created a dizzying mixture of scents. Johnny felt like he was trapped in a shabby bar at 3:00 a.m., where the air was thick with the smell of drunkenness and depravity. Shelley Winters never sat still. She constantly fidgeted, waved her arms, and talked loudly. Every time she laughed loudly, she would tilt her head back and exhale a lethal breath toward Johnny. That breath was hot, moist, and so thick with the smell of vodka that Johnny felt if he lit a match at that moment, the whole studio might burst into flames. Furthermore, Shelley was a very touchy-feely person. She frequently leaned over, using her cold and sweat-drenched hands to grab Johnny's hand or pat his cheek. Johnny shivered every time he felt the sticky dampness transfer from her hand to his. He wanted to withdraw his hand and wipe it on his pants immediately. But the minimum politeness of a host did not allow him to do so. He had to sit still and endure it, letting her caress him, while his nose had to work at full capacity to filter out the alcohol smell in the air. The peak of wetness was when Shelley decided to illustrate a story about her promiscuous love life. She picked up the water glass on the table, the glass into which the editorial staff had carefully poured only plain water, and waved it to the rhythm of her story. The water in the glass sloshed, splashing all around. Water droplets splattered onto the table surface, onto Johnny's expensive suit, and even onto his face. Johnny closed his eyes, feeling the cold drops sticking to his cheek, silently praying inside that she wouldn't throw the whole glass of water on him. Shelley seemed not to notice the destruction she was causing. She kept rambling on, her voice becoming more slurred and louder. She leaned in close to Johnny's face, close enough that he could count every wrinkle under the thick layer of powder drifting away due to the sweat on her face. Unable to endure the relentless attack of the alcohol smell and this chaos any longer, Johnny decided he had to speak up to verify his suspicion, even though he already knew the answer well. He stared into Shelley's glazed, bloodshot eyes, then glanced down at the glass of water she was holding and asked in a deadpan tone, "Shelley, I'm a bit curious. Is that glass of water you're holding pure spring water, or is it the 40-proof holy water distilled from Russia?" Shelley Winters burst into laughter, a hoarse laugh. She slapped her hand hard on the table, causing water to splash everywhere again, then winked mischievously and replied, "Oh, silly Johnny, this is just plain water to help wet my whistle, I swear, but if you have a bottle of vodka under the table, I wouldn't say no." That answer was the most eloquent confirmation of her condition. Johnny could only give a wry smile, taking out his handkerchief to wipe the water droplets sprayed on the table. When the interview ended in chaos, Shelley stood up stumbling, almost falling over if Johnny hadn't reached out to catch her in time. She hugged him tightly, a suffocating, wet, and sweat-drenched hug, leaving a patchy stain of powder and lipstick and a hauntingly pungent alcohol smell on Johnny's suit shoulder. She left, leaving a messy scene as if a tropical storm had just swept through. Truman Capote, the designer suit smelling of mildew. Dawn had just broken over the Malibu region, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the thin layer of fog covering the yacht Serengeti. Johnny Carson woke up earlier than usual. He wore a navy blue silk bathrobe, leaning against the ship's railing and using a small velvet cloth to wipe the frames of his glasses. That slow and meticulous glass wiping motion suddenly paused. His finger touched the soft velvet fabric, and a creepy feeling ran down his spine. Not because of the cold early morning wind, but because this velvet material evoked memories of another suit jacket. A very expensive one, but carrying a haunting scent of rot. The image of Truman Capote, the genius writer with the high-pitched voice and small stature, returned clearly in his mind. Johnny Carson recalled the times Truman Capote appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 70s. That was the period when Truman had slid into fame, drugs, and loneliness, although his appearance still tried to maintain the glamour of a high society gentleman. Johnny always had a conflicting feeling every time he welcomed Truman. He admired the sharp intellect of the author of Breakfast at Tiffany's, but he was terrified of this man's personal hygiene issues, unlike the blatant filth of Brando or the sloppiness of Matthau. Truman Capote was a visual trap. He always appeared with an appearance groomed to the point of gaudiness. He wore a wide-brimmed fedora, a silk scarf, and especially always wore velvet or wool suits custom-tailored by the most prestigious fashion houses in Europe. From afar, Truman looked like an expensive porcelain doll displayed in a glass case. But when Truman stepped closer to shake Johnny's hand, that glass case shattered. A strange and unpleasant scent began to spread. Johnny described it as the smell of decaying wealth. It wasn't the smell of sour sweat, but the characteristic musty smell of old clothes that hadn't been washed or sun-dried for a long time. Imagine walking into a high-end vintage store, where expensive clothes lie piled up in the dark, absorbing moisture and dust over decades. That was exactly the smell of Truman Capote. The dark purple velvet suit he wore looked luxurious, but when Johnny sat close, he could smell the moldy fabric rising pungently. It seemed Truman had worn this outfit to sleep, to parties, to drink, and even to walk in the rain without ever sending it to the dry cleaner once. Johnny Carson had to hold his breath discreetly as Truman climbed into the guest chair because of his small stature. Truman often had to struggle a bit to sit firmly, his feet swinging without touching the floor. That fidgeting action caused fabric dust and the moldy smell from the suit to fly out, enveloping the space around Johnny. Besides the damp clothing smell, Truman also carried the smell of old tobacco, not the smell of freshly lit smoke like Orson Wells, but the foul smell of cold cigarette ash that had clung tightly to the fabric fibers, mixed with the smell of pharmaceuticals and medicated oil that Truman often used to soothe pains. Combined, Truman Capote smelled like an old aristocratic lady living alone in a huge but damp and sun-deprived mansion. Johnny felt suffocated. His throat itched as if he were inhaling mold spores. Throughout the conversation, Truman Capote often had a habit of invading personal space. He frequently leaned toward Johnny, using his small but wrinkled hands to touch Johnny's sleeve whenever he wanted to emphasize a point. Truman's characteristic high-pitched voice rang out, telling sensational stories about New York high society. But Johnny could hardly focus on the story, because every time Truman moved, that musty smell rose up again, at times. Truman pulled out a silk handkerchief to wipe sweat from his forehead. That handkerchief also looked crumpled and dingy, emitting a smell of cheap perfume that had gone bad, creating a very scary, sickly sweet mixture of scents. Johnny had to try to keep a smile on his lips, but his eyes constantly glanced toward the edge of the desk, silently estimating the distance to slide his chair further away without the audience detecting it. As soon as Truman disappeared, Johnny Carson let out a long sigh, hurriedly brushing off his sleeves and chest as if wanting to shake off the invisible mold spores clinging to him. He signaled to the stagehand. This time, he didn't ask for disinfectant spray immediately, but he asked to take that chair elsewhere to sun-dry it or replace the upholstery. He didn't want the next guest to have to sit on the damp second skin that Truman left behind. Kristofferson, the sticky and dusty cowboy. The clock on the yacht Serengeti showed 11:00 a.m. The sun was high, hanging suspended overhead and pouring down onto the Malibu Sea a glaring, harsh white light. Johnny Carson had changed from his pajamas into a light blue polo shirt and neat white shorts. He sat under the umbrella on the aft deck, wearing dark sunglasses to avoid the blinding sun. In front of him was a glass of iced tea slowly melting under the harsh sunlight of the summer noon. Everything became ruthlessly clear. Johnny saw tiny dust particles floating in the beam of light shining through the umbrella gap. Those dust particles reminded him of a special guest, whose appearance always came with a hazy layer of street dust and weather-beaten roughness to the point of filth. Johnny took a sip of cold tea, grimacing slightly as he recalled the pungent smell of Kristofferson in the middle of a hot noon like this. Memory took Johnny back to the time when hippie culture and the outlaw country style began to invade Hollywood. Kristofferson was the brightest icon of that movement. Women were infatuated with Chris's wild, reckless appearance, but to a man of the old generation who preferred cleanliness, like Johnny Carson. Kris was a mobile, hygiene disaster. Every time Kris came to The Tonight Show, Johnny felt like he was welcoming someone who had just crawled out from under a truck, not from the makeup room. Johnny remembered that recording session very clearly. Kristofferson walked out onto the stage with a confident, arrogant demeanor. He wore a double denim outfit, denim jacket, and dark blue jeans under the bright studio lights. Chris's clothes were revealed to be a museum of dirt. The denim fabric was stiff, covered in pale yellow dirt streaks and patchy grease stains. Johnny had the feeling this outfit had been stuck to Chris's body for a whole month without ever touching water. When Kris approached to shake hands, Johnny clearly saw black fingernails full of dirt and calloused palms, sticky with oily sweat. Chris's handshake was very tight and hot, leaving Johnny with a sticky, uncomfortable feeling that he just wanted to wipe off immediately. Kristofferson sat down in the chair, crossing his legs comfortably. He talked and laughed while constantly raising his hand to stroke back his matted, oily hair. Johnny watched every gesture with apprehension mixed with horror. He saw that the collar of Chris's shirt had turned a yellow stain. To Kris, it was freedom, a lifestyle without constraints. But to Johnny, it was simply laziness in personal hygiene. When the program ended, Kris stood up and hugged Johnny tightly to say goodbye. That hug was a final torture, as Johnny clearly felt the smell of road dust and sweat pressing close to him. Falk, the raincoat unwashed for 1,000 years. The sun began to set gradually toward the western horizon, dyeing both the Malibu sky and the sea surface in a sad, dark purple hue. The clock on the yacht Serengeti struck 6:00 p.m. The air began to get colder and damper as night prepared to fall. Johnny Carson had thrown a thin sweater over his polo shirt. He stood leaning against the ship's railing, holding a cigar that had just been cut but not yet lit. He rotated the cigar in his hand, feeling the rough texture of the dried tobacco leaf. This action inadvertently evoked the image of another man, one who was also always associated with a cigar on his lips. But a cheap, crushed cigar, always accompanied by an appearance so disheveled it became legendary. Johnny laughed softly, the laugh dissolving into the sea breeze. The last name on the list, the one who ended his days of olfactory torture, was none other than Falk, the famous detective Columbo. When the movie Columbo was taking television by storm across America, Falk, who played the talented but disheveled detective, became a huge star warmly sought after. However, what gave Johnny Carson and the production crew a headache every time they invited Falk to The Tonight Show was the fact that he could not distinguish between acting and real life. It seemed Falk lived permanently in his character, or that character was written from his very essence. He not only brought the sharpness and absent-mindedness of Columbo, but also brought the terrible hygiene habits and the homeless fashion style of that detective into real life. Johnny remembered very clearly, every time Peter appeared at the studio, he looked like someone who had been lost in the forest for 3 days, sleeping rough and having no idea of the existence of an iron or a washing machine. The most haunting image for Johnny, and also the culprit causing the most unpleasant smell, was the famous beige raincoat that Falk always wore. On film, it was a prop that created a brand, but in real life, it was a true biological hazard. Johnny swore that Falk had worn that coat from year to year, from winter to summer, and had never washed it even once. When Peter walked out onto the stage under the bright lights, the raincoat looked wrinkled and baggy, like a piece of scrap paper that had been crumpled and then smoothed out. Its fabric surface no longer retained the original beige color, but had turned a dingy off-white, spotted with strange stains. Johnny could clearly see with the naked eye dark stains at the cuffs, a hardened, patchy coffee stain on the chest, and unidentified grease stains on the lower flap. That coat looked heavy, sticky, and exuded a weariness just like its owner. The more serious problem lay in the sense of smell. As soon as Falk sat down on the sofa reserved for guests, Johnny was attacked by a very characteristic and unpleasant antique scent. It was the smell of wool and cotton fabric, damp for a long time without being sun-dried. It was like the smell of an old duvet left forgotten in a damp basement throughout the winter, beginning to ferment and get moldy. That smell was not as pungent and harsh as Marlon Brando's body odor, but it was simmering, persistent, and caused a very uncomfortable, itchy nose feeling. Johnny felt like the air around him was covered by a layer of invisible mold dust, making his throat feel a bit dry and sore every time he breathed. Not stopping there, Peter Falk was also a heavy cigar addict, but he didn't smoke fragrant premium cigars. He usually smoked short, cheap, and very smelly cigars. Tobacco ash fell everywhere on him, clinging to the folds of the crumpled raincoat, creating an additional layer of gray dust covering the already filthy outfit. The mixture of the musty smell of old clothes blended with the acrid smell of cold tobacco ash created a suffocating atmosphere enveloping Johnny. He felt like he was sitting next to a giant mobile ashtray wrapped in a floor rag that wasn't dry. Throughout the interview, Peter Falk always showed clumsiness, rummaging, and absent-mindedness, exactly like the character Columbo. He constantly patted his coat pockets, reaching deep inside to find a lighter or some note. Every time he patted his body hard, a cloud of tiny dust flew out from the old raincoat, floating in the studio light beam and slowly landing on Johnny's shiny, dust-free desk. Johnny looked at that dust cloud with eyes of horror mixed with despair. He tried to hold his breath and discreetly used his finger to gently push his water glass away, afraid that dirt from Peter would fall into it. Peter Falk was completely oblivious to the host's discomfort. He rested his feet up, revealing suede shoes with worn-out soles covered in dry mud. He rubbed his eyes, then used that same hand covered in tobacco ash to stroke his face, leaving faint black streaks on his forehead. The peak of the challenge was when Peter Falk decided to take out a half-smoked cigar stub from his breast pocket. The cigar was crushed at one end, full of tobacco crumbs. Peter lit it, took a long, refreshing drag, and blew thick smoke toward Johnny. The acrid smell of cheap tobacco immediately rushed into Johnny's nose, making him cough lightly a few times. Ash fell scattered onto the floor and onto Peter's trousers, but he just brushed it off carelessly with his hand, making the ash dust fly even more wildly into the air. Johnny felt his patience and endurance had reached their limit. He couldn't understand how a wealthy, talented actor could let himself live so sloppily and carelessly to this extent in front of millions of viewers. Johnny Carson stood up, gently brushing his coat flap even though there was not a speck of dust. He had finished telling the 7 names. Legends, geniuses, all revealed their true forms as mortal, disheveled, and smelly human beings when stepping out of the stage aura. Johnny smiled, stepping into his clean and fragrant cabin. He realized one lucky thing: television is a miracle. It only transmits images and sound. If TVs had the function of transmitting sense too, the American audience probably would have turned off the channel long ago. Which guest story impressed you the most in Johnny Carson's list? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit subscribe to continue discovering the next secret files. The rawest corners of Hollywood are still waiting to be uncovered.